Right, can you hear me okay? What a lovely welcome, thank you. And it's honestly, it's such a joy to be here with you all. And it just worked out well because I was at a Salvation Army conference in Warwick, and then I popped up last night. We had a lovely time. Oh, I'll not move too much. Basically, there's been a lot of talk already, hasn't there, about hearts? The broken hearts that you can get on the door. We were talking about your heart, and in the worship there was the mention of hearts, and this is a slightly off tangent, but it just reminded me this is a fact of the day for you all, that when we worship together, it's actually proven that our hearts start beating in the same rhythm. I love that. I absolutely love that, because a collective of people coming together, whatever your story, whatever your background, you might identify with me today, you might not, but we all carry things where God is in the business of restoring our hearts. And when we were praying, I had a picture of God just holding our hearts in his hand. And so, sometimes that is enough. We come with our hearts broken, confused, battered, possibly unwell, but he's there, he's with us today. And I really felt that. The minute I walked in, I felt the presence of the Spirit here. And whether you're new to the church or been coming, a long time since it began, or whether you're literally looking online today to see this message, I just hope it touches your hearts in one way, shape or form. And there'll be an opportunity at the end to come and receive prayer and give this to God today. But I absolutely love that. It's changed my walk with worship when I'm listening to worship or singing. And it's helped a lot of worship leaders in the past. But today, I want to talk about courageous action. And action often means doing something, but it can also be our heart posture and turning towards God. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit. I'll tell you a bit about me, first of all, just so you know who is this stranger to your community. I actually do know someone from Bournemouth and different things, and I've met a lot of people online from the work that we've been doing around addiction, but it's so lovely to be with you all. So I live in Bournemouth, as I said. I love it down there. I love the sea. I love to look at the sea, but I'm not a big fan of going in water, I'll be honest. But I do love adrenaline. And you'll start to see a theme emerging in a little bit as I tell you a little of my story. But I've done some crazy things in my life. This was a skydive I did several years ago, which was wonderful. I did it with a Christian charity I worked for. And I'll tell you what happened actually in that, because it might make you giggle. But I was doing it with this group of Christian people. They went out of the plane first, and I was left because the weather had changed and we were circling a little bit. And I must admit, I was scared, but I also wanted to do something good in this. And raise some money for a charity I was working for at the time. And we literally just sat out of the plane, and this man is strapped to my back who I didn't know, which that in itself is a little bit odd. And literally we're looking down, and I don't know how many thousand feet up we were. And next thing he said, we're going. And next thing I'm just literally free falling. And suddenly I felt this water coming in my face. And I'm hyperventilating, and there's water, and my first thought is, oh my gosh, I've wet myself. And I'm not joking, that then made me hyperventilate even more, and I'm like, this is not right, this is not fun. And then the chute opened, and there was this beautiful peace that just happened. And suddenly I could speak to this chap I don't even know his name, and I said, oh my gosh, have I wet myself? And he went, no, my dear, it was a rain cloud. And I just literally up there, I just went, praise the Lord. And I sailed down to the ground. It was beautiful. I could see cathedral buildings in the shapes of crosses, and it's just absolutely stunning. And I got to the ground, and I could see two of my colleagues in the distance, and they literally were kneeling down, and I thought they were really prayerful people. So I bound over to pray with them. And I was like, yeah, Lord Jesus, thank you for this experience. And then I realized they weren't kneeling down to pray, they were being sick. So next, after that, literally the day after, my head was, what can I do next that is bigger and better? And this is a common theme with myself. Some of you might identify with it. And it's actually the world is telling us that we're not content with what we have. If you look at all the influences of social media and the media and everything that is out there, it's that next best thing kind of thing. And anyway, so I then decided I would do a wing walk with the Mayor of Bournemouth. I roped him into it. I'm a little bit cheeky. So that's me on top of the plane up there. And again, that wasn't enough. So I then had a flying lesson. I'm like, where does this end? So I just thought I would sort of explain a little about me. And it's great, isn't it, when we've got that nature that we want more. I mean, I'm hungry for Jesus, but we can also be hungry for other things. And often when we're in a place of pain, and life can be painful, we'll all have challenges that are going on right now or experience challenges in our life. It's where do we channel that pain? Ultimately, it would be lovely if we all channeled it straight to him, but life distracts us. Life takes us in different paths. And, you know, it can get really messy. It can be absolutely destructive in our lives. So as you can tell, I have a little bit of an all or nothing nature. And you might be then thinking that why did I tell you all this? I mean, you might be looking at me thinking I'm absolutely fearless. And that isn't the case. I carry fear, and I'm absolutely petrified of deep water. And I'm actually, weirdly, I get nervous when I come up and talk like this, because back in the day, about 18 years ago, when I was at my worst, and I'll explain about that, I couldn't be in a room with more than 2 people without either physically being sick or having an anxiety attack. So this here right now, I give God absolutely all the glory, because this is not what, for many years of my life was gripped in fear, anxiety, brokenness. And I still get anxious about things like this today. But that's a good thing for me today, because it means something. It's not about ego. And, you know, I'm here to share a story, but also bring scripture into this. And I believe that we can turn our battles into blessings, that our mess can be a message. That has been, you know, one of my biggest sort of, you know, things I hold on to. And I see that. And I mentioned earlier, we live in an instant gratification culture. We're in an age of indulgence. If you look, we're not content with what we have. People want the next best thing. And like I said, people can often go about this the wrong way. And I also see a lot of people that don't feel they're equipped or, you know, qualified, not necessarily in the sort of, you know, education sense, but not qualified to step in and help somebody or to do something. And that's also been my experience. And we get stuck in places because of fear. And basically, you know, this is why I've chosen about courageous action. Before coming here today, I was listening to Heath's preach last week. And he was talking all about moving into the unknown and trusting. And I've been praying about this today, and I got a real sense that I didn't know how many people were here, the building, anything to do with what you've got here. But I had a real sense that God is going to break down these walls and open up this even further. And I don't just mean in the size, but in the extent of the impact that this worshipping community can have, that your hearts beating as one can start helping others to realize that they have hearts that are worth beating. And that's been my sort of feel, and I felt it again as I walked in today. And I want to talk to you about, I'm going to share with you a passage in the Bible that really speaks to me. And it's from Matthew, and it's his account, well, it's the account of when Peter walks on water towards Jesus. And you may, if you're new to church, this is just one of the beautiful, miraculous stories in the Bible that shows, and I'll explain why it's so important to me after we've read it together. And just to set the scene, just before this story, Jesus and the disciples have had a pretty busy time. Literally just before this, they'd fed the 5,000 and they were now on a boat. I mean, they don't do things by halves. They maybe have a little nature like me. And literally the disciples are on a boat, and we'll see what happens. Let's read it together. It's in Matthew 14, if you've got your Bibles or your phones, or it'll be up on the screen. And it's verses 22 to 23, and I'm going to read from the NIV version. You might not be able to read it, but I will read it out to you. So immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. I forgot that. Yeah. I think I'd be terrified as well if I saw somebody walking on the lake, towards me, because it's not your sort of average thing you see, is it? They were terrified, and it's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, another amazing thing, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" And I believe he said it in that loving, kind way, like just the words. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, but those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." I mean, this is a big passage in the Bible, even though, it's quite a sort of straightforward story, but there's a lot of miracles, miraculous things that happen in that. But really, there's two things that I really sort of like stand out for me. Firstly, it was Jesus' nature was so unbelievably kind. He did not condemn Peter at all. When he said, "You have little faith," he wasn't saying, you've done something wrong or anything like that. He was just saying, acknowledging, "You've got a little faith going on there, Peter." And he said, "Why did you doubt me?" In my eyes, it's like, "Peter, I love you. You kind of slipped up then. You took your eyes off the ball, but come back to me." And I love that. I mean, if we imagine sharing that nature with people we come across that are living in darkness, in brokenness, in sin, and we adopted that compassion to people and just walked with them and said, "Hey, I'm here. I'm with you." I love that about, seeing Jesus's character to the people that he loved. It was almost like Jesus being a mentoring encourager. I love that sort of thought. And it makes me realize, I'm quite a visual person, so I can imagine that in the sense of Jesus with me in times where I struggle. I take my eyes off the ball all the time, but he's just there saying, "Come back to me." And the second thing is, when Peter took his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. And he was focusing on the problem, not on the solution, which was to reach out. And that, again, is something that I would love to model in my life more and more. We have to be courageous sometimes and take those first steps towards him. And that is my experience. And people have walked alongside me in times, and I believe they were God-given at times when I needed them the most. And there's no way in human power I could be stood here if it wasn't for the people that God has brought alongside me in the journey that I've been on. And it takes courage, doesn't it, to step out of our comfort zones in any sense. And I'm not just talking about massive things, in small things sometimes. I've been stood here looking at the boxing things here. And I mean, years ago, I've always wanted to try boxing, but there was this fear that stopped me. So I thought, what would other people think? I'm not going to be good enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not fit enough. The list went on, and I had all these excuses of not to do it. And anyway, for about 5-6 years, I've been boxing, and I absolutely love it. And in that, my strength built up. And when I got attacked abroad several years ago, I had the strength in me to fight somebody off, and not properly fight them, but I was, but why? There's so many things that fear stops us doing these days. But God knows, and God will be like walking with us in this. So a little of my actual story and my testimony, and I'll relate this back to what we talked about in this passage. I give, like I said, I give God all the glory for what he's done in my life. It is absolutely amazing. And I get the privilege in the field I'm in to see it happening for other people. And I got brought up in a loving Christian home. My dad had left when I was tiny, but my mum was an absolute devout Christian. And she used to take me along I was in a very traditional Anglican church. And I was in the choir, had to wear a red robe and carry things and stuff. And I'd always be the person that would say, I'll clean the wine goblet at the end of the service, because they had big, quite hefty glasses of wine in the communion. And everyone thought I was just a really, really well-behaved kid. It wasn't. It was because I always knew there was a bit left over. And if I took it away and cleaned it, I could drink it. And also, I mean, that carried on for many years. And my neighbour happened to be a vicar. And he had a little bit of a drink problem. But I would always say, because he used to go on holiday a lot, I'd always say, can I feed your cat? And he thought, again, what a lovely young lady. She wants to help me. Well, what I'd do is I would feed the cat, but I would go in and I would get the key, because I knew where it was, because I'd seen him hide it once, to his wine cellar. And I would go down into the wine cellar, and then I would literally get his lovely bottles of red wine, drink them, and fill them up with Ribena and put the lids back on. I have made amends for this, I promise you, but you can see a theme emerging. I might have looked like the good, young lady doing the right thing, but actually in secret, there was a habit bubbling away, which linked to alcohol. And I ended up going to, this carried on for quite a long time, and I didn't know. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but looking back, I can see how alcohol started to dominate my life. Even to the point where I was quite well educated. It's funny, I was listening to Helen's preach the other day about her studying law. I'd done law in different A-levels. And I went to Cardiff University, where I decided I was going to go. And they offered me all these different degrees. Firstly, it was business studies. And I thought, oh gosh, no, that's too clever. And no offense to anyone that studied business studies, my hat goes off to you. But I had an excuse for everything. And so I said no to that one. They then said, what about sports recreation? I thought, absolutely not. That's far too energetic. And then they said, what about hospitality management? And I honestly didn't know what that meant, what it entailed. And I said to the lecturer, well, what's involved? And he said a load of different things. But then he said the one thing that my ears pricked up to, he said, there's wine tasting every Friday. So I grabbed the pen and I signed up to this degree that was a 4-year degree based on that. So you can see that this unhealthy pattern was there. And I ended up drinking a lot. And this progressed to the point where at my worst at 28, after a catalogue of carnage, and I turned away from practicing faith, I'd let everything go that was important to me. I'd taken my eyes off him, and I was focusing on a worldly desire, and I literally ended up at my worst drinking 2 litres of vodka a day at the age of 28, wanting to die. And this is a picture of me at 28 years old. So you're looking at sort of 17 years ago, 18 years ago, when I went into a rehab, because everyone had given up on me. The only person that hadn't was my mum, who was the one person that still believed that there was hope. and she was praying over me, and she was praying that something would happen and change. And I ended up, I didn't know who I was at this point. I know it's not about the physical, but inside I was broken spiritually. I was void at that time. And it was like an outward pain became an inward pain in that moment. But people came alongside me and helped me into a place of hope. And I had to take the action of also getting there. But that took courage. I was frightened. I was absolutely petrified and scared, because alcohol had become my best friend, but my worst enemy in that moment. And I couldn't get out of it. And so many people said, a nice girl like you, why are you doing this? I'd lost the power of choice. And that's really what addiction is in a nutshell. People lose the power of choice and become powerless. And I literally was so blessed that I went into this 12-step rehab, which talked about God. And that night in that rehab, I literally prayed to God and said, if you can help me to get through this, I promise I will devote my life to helping other people on this journey of addiction. And I didn't know the extent of that prayer. And in my recovery, I'd love to tell you everything's been plain sailing. It hasn't. If anything, putting down the substance made me had to face the reality of life. And life's hard. Life, as I know, this community has suffered a lot lately in many ways. We experience absolute devastation through our lives. But I just think, I feel so grateful that I have Jesus walking alongside me in this. And I do believe that over time, hope returned for me. And that sinking feeling started feeling less, but it took a long time. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, praise God, I've been sober over 12 years now, because I did end up drinking again. And that was a moment where I took my eye off the ball, and ended up having 2 weeks of carnage. But it was a beautiful experience, because I ended up in court because I had a period of drink driving in that time. And I remember having to, I ended up a few years later appearing in front of some magistrates to get my driving license back. And they asked me, would I ever need to drink again? And I said, if I keep God at the center and help others, I don't honestly believe I will ever have to. And that's been my experience to date. And he can do that for any of us in any of the difficulties that we face. And the thing is about addiction, when I say addiction, what comes to mind? It's usually drugs and alcohol. And yes, my story is about alcohol, but we live in a world today where there's destructive habits and compulsive behaviors that it estimates that 80 to 90% of people, and if you look at how many people are in here, 80 to 90% of us, it says, have some form of habit, destructive behavior, or as full-blown as an addiction, that if they were free of, they'd be happier and live lives more fully. That could be anything, not just drugs and alcohol. It could be food, gambling, pornography, sexual addictions, social media, mobile phones. There's a new mobophonia, I think it's called. It's natural. They're now saying it's an addiction to mobile phones. I mean, imagine if, I expect most of us now have got a mobile phone on us, apart from the very young people in the audience. If I was to take your phone off you now and said you're not going to get that back for a week, I wonder how you'd feel. Because we now use that as our source. I can see some people at the back going, oh, it becomes, not for everybody, but a lot of people now, everything is on there. But when you'll say, for example, on Facebook, I know that's a bit old school for your younger ones, maybe Instagram or whatever it might be. Snapchat, yes. Okay, so when you get a like on Snapchat or whatever it is that you might be on, that actually releases a tiny dopamine hit into the brain, which feeds, it's that, the like kind of the warm feeling we get sometimes when we get a like or we get something. And actually that is no different. That dopamine is what someone gets when they take a drug. It's a mental stimuli. And we don't know what we're being fed all the time through these sources. And, there's a book called Dopamine Nation, which talks about this. And I just wanted to read out this one little thing. It says, we live in a time of unprecedented access to high reward, high dopamine stimuli, drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, messaging, sexting, tweeting. The smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. We all become vulnerable to compulsive overconsumption. And I mean, that challenges me, but I see it all the time with people. How many times do you walk down the street or go into a restaurant and you see people on their phone and not engaging with each other? You know, we could adopt like fasting from our mobile phones as an idea, you know. And when I say, you know, I'm talking about so many different types of addiction. I've had a few experiences that really challenged me, and some that have been on some training with me might have heard this, but I think it's important to share it. Having led a life of addiction myself, you'd think that I might have a bit of a clue about this stuff. But actually, I went to watch a course running in a church years ago when I first started on this journey of how, you know, faith and recovery can come together. And I got put in this little group of women, and there was probably about 10 ladies. All of them were similar age to me, except for one little woman who, she must have been in her 80s. She looked a bit like my late grandmother. I thought she must be there bringing somebody along and supporting them, because we often see the families and friends bringing people. And we went around this group and we literally explained what everybody was coming to the group for in regard to the addiction. And a lot of the ladies said alcohol or drugs, so crack cocaine, heroin. And it got to this little woman that was like next to me, and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, Emma, I've got a habit." And I was like, interesting. And she said, "Yes, it's the first thing I do in the morning, the last thing I do at night. I spend all my money on it." Her husband, who she'd been married to for 50 years, was thinking of divorcing her. Her children weren't speaking to her. And I saw this pain in this lady's eyes, not dissimilar to the pain that I know I experienced when I was wanting to die, drinking 2 litres of vodka a day. And I was literally out of my seat. I was like, "What is it?" You know, and she said, I'm addicted to cross stitch, like knitting type stuff. And I was like, "What? Really?" And she was like, I literally was so shocked. But then the pain, honestly, in her face. And I realized in that moment, it was not about the substance or the habit. It was about the pain. Addiction, compulsive behaviors, and destructive habits are all a result of pain. And if they are not addressed and brought to the surface, how can the light get in and actually help to sort this out? And it was a real challenging moment for me, because that changed how I perceive people. And I believe that we need to be talking about this stuff more. You know, we need to change a culture that it's okay to share the things that are gripping us in life. There is no shame in that. There is strength. And turn our eyes towards Jesus in those moments. But we sometimes need people to show us what that turning looks like. And there's a physical action, courageous action in turning, a physicality. So we're living in a pandemic of addiction. And addictions are all around. I've heard a terrible story lately. Gaming, for example, with people that are young and not necessarily just young, and it can actually affect anybody. But gaming, you think it might be just a harmless bit of fun having a game on the internet and things. There was an article I saw about a young man who they had to get the paramedics to his house because his body had morphed into his gaming chair, where he hadn't got up for over a month. And they had to take him and the chair to the hospital because it had all, and this is a young lad. Has anyone been looking at all, over their lifetime for a new house or somewhere to rent? There's an app called Rightmove. I saw another article recently of a young lady who was so addicted to that, she lost her job because all she would do was go onto it constantly through the day. She didn't even need anywhere else to live. But she'd got into that check, the news, when we get the check, this is the sort of thing we're seeing and we're contending with. So I hope in some ways that this does challenge some of us to think about some of those areas in our life that we need a little bit more freedom from, or need complete freedom from, actually. And we'll have an opportunity to pray about that later, because I believe that this could completely transform our walks to be able to help those in and outside. And I'm not just saying just outside of these walls. There will be people in here today that need a fresh touch of the Spirit in this area of their life. And I just want to say, and I'll end it on this in a minute, because I've spoken for 25 minutes, and I've been given 30. I'm very mindful of the time. I said it'd be 25, but I do like talking. It's funny, isn't it? But every day, we face moments in our lives of, I can't do this. Just like Peter must have had that moment when he was looking at Jesus, but then looking at the storm. And sometimes things can seem absolutely unimaginably hard. But stepping towards whatever that is takes courage. It means leaving fear behind, stepping out in courage. And I do believe that God is calling us as a church in order to take courageous action, to step out of our own fears, to be able to be in a place of healing, of freedom, to be able to help those that also need healing and freedom. I always say I can't give away what I haven't got myself, actually. And I wasn't going to say that, but I really felt as I was talking that is. It's almost getting our heart posture right before we dive in and help. That might be an opportunity to do with us today. And I'm going to share with you a story as I come to close what I've talked about today, that really, for two reasons. Firstly, was that it was an encounter I had when I actually saw Jesus in the room with me. I can't tell you what he looked like, but I know he was physically in that space when I had one of the most horrific moments of my life. And like I said to you, I ended up drinking again over 12 years ago, and good people came alongside me and helped me get back into recovery. And I was 6 weeks sober. And I've mentioned my mum a bit. She's amazing. She's been a pharmacist all her life. She's worked helping addicts and people with addiction. And I always said when I used to meet the addicts in the pharmacy, I'll never end up like that. But, things happen. And she's been an absolute rock to me, supported me, helped me to get to rehab, loved me, prayed for me. And I took her away, which I'd planned before my last drink. I'd planned that she's always wanted to go to Iceland. And this is Iceland, the country, not the shop. Because someone said to me once, that was a really cheap amends process of taking your mum to a frozen food store. And I took her to Iceland, and we had this beautiful weekend away, and we came back to my place in Bournemouth. And at the time I was in a shared sort of bedsit house, and we woke up the following morning, and she was about to drive back to Wales, and we're talking, and she literally had suddenly just collapsed on the floor. And I thought she'd just fallen over something like a rug or something. She hadn't. She'd had a sudden cardiac arrest in that moment, and she'd been fit and healthy. It was just very sudden. It was, and I'm sorry if anybody's ever witnessed that, because it was horrific. And in that moment, I had to take action. There was something I knew that I was in a position where in that moment something had to be done. So I phoned the paramedics. I had them on the phone. They said to me, is there anyone else in the house that can help you? This is not going to be easy. And I went and got a friend of mine, and this is, beautifully how God works. My friend, the day before, we've been talking about faith. I'd been saying to her, she was also on a recovery journey. I was saying, sometimes things just happen. You're in the right place at the right time. Someone is there that you can actually speak truth and life into or help. And anyway, she was home, and she shouldn't have been at home, but it was her birthday. And that one day of the year, her work gave her birthday off work. So she was there having a lay in. I ran and got her. She came into the room with me. We started CPR on my mum. And I was doing it to the Vinnie Jones at the time, was doing an advert, staying alive. She was doing it to Nellie the elephant, which she'd been taught. She'd actually only had, just 2 weeks before, she'd had her first aid training. So she was really confident in that. And I only knew a little fraction from what I'd seen on telly. but the two of us did CPR on my mum. 8 minutes it took for the ambulance to get to us, which is unheard of nowadays. But back then, they came and they literally took over and they started injecting her, getting her clothes off. They got the paddles out to shock her heart. And all I could do was stand back, and I started praying. And I was praying the serenity prayer, which we use in recovery. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And I stood back, and they shot my mum's heart sort of 6-7 times. And I knew it wasn't looking good. I could see on their faces, it wasn't looking good. And they turned around to me and they said, the guy with the paddles, he looked and he said, "I'm so sorry, we can't do any more." And I knew, I could feel the presence of God in the room, and I saw a person in the room with us. And I know that was Jesus there. I mean, I believe he's with us right here, right now. But in that moment, he gave me what I needed, which I received this beautiful, we were talking about praying for peace earlier. I received this beautiful peace. And I looked back at this paramedic and I said, "Please, can you try one more time?" And he did. And it took a few moments, but my mum's heart started to beat again. And I was able to be a daughter and be there in her moment of need. And there's no way 6 weeks prior to that I would have been in a position to be able to do that. And the beautiful thing is, God doesn't just end there. He doesn't just do that. My mum is better. She's written a program to support families in addiction, which is going nationally. God is in the business of turning our absolute mess and our brokenness and those situations, no matter how dire they might seem, to something of his purpose. And that has been my experience. And the thing is, in that moment, and this is the message, I only knew a fraction of first aid, but it was enough to actually step in and change the whole trajectory of a situation that was going on in our midst. And I believe that takes courageous action. That's what I believe that we can do in order to change people's lives. It might just be as simply as praying with someone in a moment when I come to close, someone that God has put on your heart reaching out to. It may be yourself taking the action to get healing today around something that is gripping you, secrets keep us sick. When we expose secrets into the light, he does amazing things, and nothing is a surprise in God's eyes. And he's here to forgive, to heal, to mend broken hearts today. My question, are we willing to step out of that boat today? Are we willing to turn our faces more towards him around something that's going on in our life, or help someone else that is? It's an absolute privilege to be with you all and to join you. Bit of a challenge, I know, but I hope that that's touched someone's heart today. And I believe he's in the business of mending hearts today, so we can help mend others.